In 2001, I contacted the section of the cemetery here in town. I believe his name was Irving, and we walked up and down the rows of the cemetery out there, and I physically inventoried the Civil War soldiers in the cemetery. This you can get off the internet, as it is here. Civil War veterans from Bremen and community, compiled by the Bremen Public Library. Now, I know that the Bremen Library is here, and they did an excellent job. Now, what this is here, this is an index of all the names in this 15-page document I have here that you can get off the internet. And so the red was the one I started in 2001. I walked up and down there and took everything I could. Then I went to the library, to the official registers, official records, and found some of the units these guys are in. So if you look on the side of this, I've annotated the regiment that I know these guys were part of. And like 29th, that's the 29th Infantry, but actually they called the 29th Volunteers back in that day. And so I've identified the regiments they're in. I'll get back to that a little bit later. So to start off with, you can get this right off your internet, and it's called the Civil War Veterans from Bremen and Community. And you can kind of come up and you get an awful lot of data on it. It's kind of interesting. What I found interesting was going down there and seeing if I recognize any of the surnames still in town. I recognize a lot of you guys. And so that can become something you can follow up on. You can say, hey, maybe you had one back then that was in the Civil War. There's a good chance of it. So this is an index to this wonderful topic. And thank you, Bremen Library. You did a great job. And I'm going to pass this around, let you take a look at what's there, and I'll pick it up back here when I get done. Okay, I'm going to start off with some anecdotal stories. It's just to warm things up. Yes, you have something to be interested in the Civil War, because after I got into what I saw was here, some of your relatives were exactly what is on the side of that cannon. It says, to the heroes of the 1861 and 1865 war. When I get done tonight, you will know they were heroes. These veterans were in the Western Theater, and they were in some of the absolutely most awful battles of the war. And what makes it nice is they're the ones that helped win the war, too. I've been interested in the Civil War since I was in high school. And I'm from Kansas City, and I knew there had been a big battle in Kansas City called the Battle of Westport Landing. Anybody ever heard of that one? It's Western. It's when a big Southern army invaded the North and tried to just cause a lot of commotion. And what I didn't know was all I had to do was step out my front door of my home, and I'd be on a battlefield of that war. Because the big battle of West Point Landing was right on the land that my home was on. If I went 2 miles west or 2 miles east, I'd be off it. And I didn't know it. Now, if I had known that, I would have done everything but steal the money to get a metal detector. And I would have scouted out everything that was there. Because I didn't know someone's beat me to it. So someone's got all that loot that I could have had. And so there's things here that if you just look and knew about it, it's right there. It's part of your history, your chances to enjoy your cultural background. To make this more interesting too, 3 blocks north of my home in Kansas City was the old cemetery with the old stone fence around it and all that sort of stuff. What I didn't know was inside that was a monument to Civil War veterans, about 15 to 20 feet high. The only thing that's strange is the tombstones around it had Confederate flags on it. And I didn't know that. And buried there is one of the famous generals of the Civil War. General Shelby was buried 3 blocks from my home. I didn't know it. And so there's all sorts of things when you open up your attic and look for letters or talk to your aunt, or there's things that's going to surprise you that you have that's interesting. Believe it or not, if you have letters from that time, they're interesting, they're valuable. I'm going to point out what happened in the Civil War. We'll give you a little background so you'll understand a little bit more how valuable and important the contribution was of those veterans that buried out in that cemetery. The first thing I want to point out is a little bit of military science, kind of interesting. The battles in the East, where Lee was, you know, everybody's read about them, and militarily, they were full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Let that sort of sink in. The war was won in the West. So I'm going to give a little bit of background why you can see that was happening. This was not a surprise to either the North or the South military commanders. They knew that from the very start. The Eastern battles was a stalemate. Now I'm going to show you why it was. Okay, you have an army that's going on the attack, and he has a base. And you have an army that's on the defense, and he has a base. They come in and they hit. Bang. That's nice. Now what happens if the army on the attack also has a base on the side? And so here comes the defender, and he comes in the side and forces what they call a turning movement, which means that now the defender has to fight on territory he did not choose, which means he's going to lose. Now let's go back and look what happened in the Eastern theater. We have, the North has a base, right? The South had a base. The North owned the oceans and the rivers. And so on the East, the North had an aquatic base, and they used it. On the West, the South had a base in the Shenandoah Valley, which means any time an army tried to go north, it got hit on the South. And any time an army tried to go south, it got hit on the South, and nothing happened. And so all you see happening for 5 years is people going north and south and getting kicked in the side. Nothing was gained. This is called a stalemate. They both knew it was going to happen. Even before the war started, they knew that was going to happen. And the South was very happy to have it, because they figured if they could stalemate long enough, the North would go away. Right? And so all the military geniuses in 1861 said the South's going to win, because the North can't win. And they were, in fact, there's people still surprised the North won after the war was won. There was nothing could happen in the East. It couldn't happen at all. It all happened in the West. And the South had it on the North there. The South was supreme in the West at the start of the war too. So they thought they had it won. And so let's see what did happen. Okay. The big thing that was happened was the railroads. By 1860s, the railroads were dominant. You can move all over the South, and here's what the South has done. Now let's take a look. This is what I've done here is put this on the grid, and everything's show that everything's in line. You can see it better. And so here is the Mississippi River, and we have St. Louis, and we have Cairo, Illinois, and we have Memphis here, and we have Pittsburgh here, and we have New Orleans, and they're all ports for the South. And on the east, we have the ocean here, and we have Norfolk, we have Charleston, we have Savannah on the east, all southern ports. On the south, we have Mobile and Pensacola, Florida, as well as New Orleans, and this is all water. And on the north, we have Paducah, Louisville, and Cincinnati, and this is the Ohio River. If you look at what happened in the West, the South was totally surrounded by water. Okay. But they had ports everywhere. And if you look at this, every one of those ports, you could go from any one of these ports to any of the other ports by rail. That's called internal lines of communication. They were totally connected by rail at that time. And right here is 1859, they came over the mountains, and now they had connection that they could go from Memphis, Tennessee to Norfolk by rail, straight, by 1859. They could go from Vicksburg to Savannah, Georgia by rail. They were totally connected. They could go north, south, east, west by rail. They're totally connected. And I've given you a little bit of strategic things to read when you, it's called interior lines. Any military person knows that's a dominant tool. And in fact, that's what Wellington used on Napoleon and P. And so they had interior lines, and they knew it. The North knew it. And so neither the North nor the South were in the dark about anything in 1861. And everybody said, how in the world are you going to beat the South? Everybody said, you can't do it. Well, here's the nice thing about it. Both Lincoln and Halleck knew the war was going to be won in the West. The South didn't. The South had one general that knew it, and they shouted him down. He was Joseph Johnson. And he and the president of the South didn't get along, so they ignored him. And Johnson knew that the things were going to end in the West. And so did Grant. Now, I like to think of Grant as the lock picker. Every time the South closed the door and locked it, here came Grant with his keys and he unlocked it. That's exactly what happened. Okay, the first line right here is the first line of defense. That's where they thought they were going to hold the North off in 1861. You can't get past here. We got a rail line, we can move all around, do anything we want. You can't beat us here. And they had a Albert Sidney Johnson general they thought was a genius, and he was. And that was his plan. And what I like about it, he put all his supplies right here. And Grant said, oh boy. And so the North owned all the rivers and all the oceans. They commanded the waterways. And so here's the Tennessee, here's the Columbus, and here's the Green River. Okay. And Grant hit these two forts. This is Fort Henry, Fort Donelson. He took them just like that. In fact, he took this one so well at Donelson, he captured an entire army. And there's an interesting anecdotal story there. The top commander there turned to the second in command and says, take over, I'm leaving. He bugged out. The second in command said, take over to the third, I'm bugging out. They both bugged out, and the third guy had to surrender to Grant. And he was a guy who had, years before had loaned Grant money. So it was kind of... So anyhow, by early in 1862, now they owned this, and he came right down to here. To Shiloh, Tennessee is right here. Deep inside the Southern Command. Well, what that does is it puts an army behind all this stuff, doesn't it? He unlocked this entire thing without fighting the battle. And what I like about it is, when they fell back, they had to destroy all their supplies. They had to steal them. The guy was a genius. Anyhow, this is where Grant was very poorly experienced. He should have expected the next thing to happen. He was inexperienced at that time. They fought the Battle of Shiloh, and he was caught off guard. What was happening was, Grant was right here, and they had an army coming from Nashville down to make a junction with Grant, okay? Don't think for a moment the South didn't know that. And they knew, hey, we don't want these two armies together, that's too big, right? So here's where the rails come into play. What they did was, here's Corinth. They took and moved all their troops over to Corinth. Going from the east, from the west, from the south, and they put a big army in Corinth, and they did it very quickly by rail, and the North didn't know it. And so here's these two armies coming to get together in the North, and here's this big one forming over here. And they came and they hit Grant, and almost destroyed him. And it's just fortunate this army coming from the north here was so close. That night, they made junction, and he barely won the Battle of Shiloh. If it had been a more mature Grant, that wouldn't have happened. He would have expected that. Well, the first thing they did, and it's the big thing I'm going to show you here. I'm going to back off and show you something. I told you they could go anywhere with their rail system, didn't I? If you take two cities, the whole thing falls apart. If you take Corinth and take Atlanta, they no longer can go anywhere. So the first thing Grant did was take Corinth. And then the big battle started after that in the west. They had to come down this way and go this way to get to Atlanta, and they had to go through Chattanooga here. By the time they get down to here, they no longer could protect their supply line. They were cutting it all the time. So they finally got to Chattanooga, Tennessee. A guy named Rosecrans did. He was a good general. But here's the thing about Rosecrans. He finally got down to Chattanooga. Hard work when he got there. What he didn't expect was the South did it again to him. The South used their railroads and brought all their army and put it just south of Chattanooga. And when he took off to go further south to Atlanta, Georgia, from Chattanooga, he did know for the first time in his life he was facing an army that's a good deal bigger than his. It's about like a welterweight trying to take on a heavyweight. And the Battle of Chickamauga occurred, he was just destroyed. And so these are the little things that happen. They're fighting out the west. The guys that are buried out there in that cemetery went through all those battles. They were awful. But they're the ones that fought these battles and won the west. What happens, they finally got down to Atlanta, Georgia. And of course, you've all seen Gone with the Wind. That's the big one. And once Atlanta, Georgia was taken, Corinth was taken, the South was in shambles. They couldn't move. Brilliant piece of work. It took someone with a military genius to say, hey, that's so simple, just hit those two places and they're done. And so once they got to Atlanta, Georgia, now they knew they couldn't protect their supply line, so Grant said, we're not going to try, we're just going to make a raid and go to the sea here. Chopped them into. And that's pretty much the summation of the war in the West. Sounds pretty simple now, but it's horrible battles. And those guys buried in that cemetery are in those battles. The big picture, of course, was seen immediately by a guy named Winfield Scott in 1861. He told the president how to take apart the South. He said, it's the anaconda. You take and barricade them on the Ohio, take the Mississippi, control all the ports on the side, and let them starve to death. And they did do that. But the next thing was to chop them in two right across here. And that's what Grant and Sherman did. Now, they were cut here, they were cut here, they were cut here, they were cut here. It was over with. That's pretty much the strategy of the Civil War. Now, let's look and see a little bit about what we have here in the few minutes I have left. I hope I've made this kind of interesting for you. It sounds awful simple now, but that's because it took a genius like Grant to figure it out. There was people after the war that still think, how did you do it? The South had everything on their side when the war started. And he figured out how to just, okay, a little bit here, a little bit. He was the lock picker. He just, every time they tried to lock something, he just locked it. Of course, the second lock he unlocked was Vicksburg. They thought they had the door shut there. And he says, okay, fine, I don't need a supply line. He just came around behind him. And what he did was the fellow was defending Vicksburg. He came out behind his defenses to hit Grant's supply line. There wasn't any there. And so they both had a race back to Vicksburg. Well, that was neat. What a sucker play. And so, anyhow, the guys that you find in the cemetery were in these terrible battles. And they are heroes. And they were part that won the war. And so I think it would be interesting for you if you find any of your relatives where they were. The battles are just fantastic. Now, what I'm going to do is show you what's right here, what I found here. When Virginia asked me to find out something about Bremen, I said, how am I going to do about this little town? And you asked me on a big war like that to find something that would be perfect here, and how am I going to do that? And when I opened up and started looking at the information in the cemetery, I opened it up. And so what I have here, at the very top, you can see the 20th Infantry, the 22nd, the 23rd, 29th. All those units are in that cemetery. And then I noticed that, if you look at the far right, one of those units has 7 veterans there. Well, I'll bet you that the 29th Volunteers, they organized a report on the 27th of August, 1861. I'll bet you they were loaded with people from this area, don't you? If you were to get out the roster of that regiment, you'd probably start finding all sorts of your relatives there. And so I have pretty much found where Bremen would be expected to be in these units. They were there. Some we had 3. The 23rd Infantry was New Albany. That's not too far from here. And they had the Evansville and Goshen. They all had several veterans there. Well, I'll bet you there was lots of Bremen people in those units. So in those 9 units, I'll bet you'll find a lot of the people that eventually came here. Now there's hundreds of regiments in the Army. And I've been able to point to 9 of them. So start digging. You'll probably find some of your people there. Maybe you'll find out more about what they did. Now I'm going to tell you one more anecdote that I went through. I had a great-grandfather who rose to be a lieutenant in the Army of the Northern, McClellan's Army. And I have a picture of 1918 where he's sitting on the porch with the whole family. They had a big, it was a 50, something, I think it was 50-year marriage, whatever it was. And there's all sorts of people there. And of course I saw my aunt, she was 7. I saw people I knew there. And there he was, the patriarch. We knew he was in the Civil War. No verbal history came down. He did not talk about it. Until I did some research, I didn't even know he was a lieutenant. Then I found out he was shot. There is no oral history at all. They did not talk. And so you may find some very interesting thing about your people. I'm assuming you're going to find some if you look. But in my family, I knew I had one, and then I found out when I did research he was an officer and he was shot. Wow. That's all news to me, too. And so it can happen to you. What I'm going to show you is, I'll just say a little bit more. The 20th Infantry is interesting. If you look at that, you'll see it was just torn up. The 20th Infantry was in the McClellan's Army. It's the only one that went east. Folded into the 20th Infantry, it was one of the most important regiments of the war, the 19th Indiana, the Black Hats, were after Gettysburg, were folded into the 20th Infantry. And so the Black Hats went into the 20th Infantry. Now I'll tell you a little bit more about the Black Hats. They're called Black Hats because that's what they wore. And they were the toughest, just about the toughest regiment in the Eastern Army. They were in the 1st Corps, 1st Division, 1st Brigade, number 1111. And they're the hardest fighting bunch. But what I like is one anecdote, and I want to close with this anecdote. At Gettysburg, Gettysburg was a collision. It was not planned. And so is trying to buy time to try to get all the Union forces there because the overwhelming force was on the south. And so there was a cavalry brigade that was holding them back, and they had been just hit on the flank, and the south thought they had them coming around, and they knew the north was coming up, and they thought they were going to meet some militia, so they were just waiting for them. And then the first thing they saw breaking the crest of the hill above them were the Black Hats. Here comes the Black Hats. Oh my gosh, they had the worst bunch in the world to fight. And it happened the first day of Gettysburg. And saving time were the Black Hats, the 19th Indiana, and they were absolutely destroyed. But they stopped. It was that regiment was largely responsible for stopping a corps. And they fought to the death. That was an Indiana regiment. Well, that regiment got folded into the 20th. I just thought I'd tell you that story. But I like that one. They thought they had, the South thought they had just militia to deal with. The first thing they saw was the darn Black Hats. That's the worst thing they could have found. Okay, so thank you for your time. And you want to come up and show those pictures? Meanwhile, I'm going to do a little lobbying. I run the Civil War Roundtable. We meet the second Tuesday of each month, starting in March. And is there anybody that want to raise their hand and say they'd like to be there? I'd love to see you there. It's over in the library in Plymouth, and at 7 o'clock, and it'll be in the paper. So I hope I've stirred up things and said, hey, this can be interesting. And I hope some of you will go back and start digging out the chest and seeing if there's any letters or anything like that, because your relatives that were in that war were absolutely in the worst part, I think. Okay, thank you.
In looking through some of the photos, Historic Bremen has this photograph, and this is 1913, and it's Memorial Day, and it's a parade of the Civil War soldiers. So there are, I think, 7 soldiers in this picture. There's one that's a bigger picture, and this is more of a close-up. And maybe you can recognize one of your relatives. Unfortunately, there's no names with this. So that's something to take a look at. I think we want to open it up for questions for Lowell.
Any questions? Yes.
There's a small book up on the table there, and it's a Civil War stories for Shelby County. And the reason I mention that is the number of people who enlisted from one county in Indiana. The enlistments were 3,000 people. Basically, you could enlist and then you re-enlisted. So there was really about 2,000 from that county that went to the Civil War. 200 of them died. About a quarter of those died in battle. The rest of them died from accidents, disease, whatever. And that was a big problem in the Civil War was the disease. And but I just think it's amazing the number of people who were in the Civil War. And that's just one county in Indiana.
It changed the entire nation. Roughly a quarter of the men of marriageable age in the South were killed. Just think about that. What would that do to the economy after the war? And the biggest expense of many of the southern counties after the war was for artificial limbs. That's how awful that war was. Well, I want to thank you for inviting me. I've had a good time. I hope you have. And I hope you have been encouraged to look into your suitcases and whatever to start seeing what you've got. Because after I looked and saw who was buried out there in that cemetery, I said, wow, these guys really were important. If you look up at the battles those regiments were in, and if you know anything about the Civil War, you just say, wow. Okay, thank you.